Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we're honored to have as our guest Cook County Clerk David Orr, also former Mayor of Chicago, David Orr, all rolled up in the same person. David, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you, Kevin. I know it's been a while. Been trying to get out here.
Yeah.
We out here in Elmhurst.
Yeah, yes. I keep telling people, there's civilization out here. They have running water and electricity.
I was raised in Lombard.
That's so you know.
So,
yes, you're a West
I
Suburban
know.
guy.
That's right. I'm a DuPage County guy.
There you go. Yeah. Welcome to the show. And as you know, we talk about all sorts of issues here on Public Perspective. And one of the things we keep coming back to is budgets, money, the fact that the state is broke, the fact that everybody's looking for money somewhere. And one of the things that people know very little about, but that you've tried to make a point of, and that you've tried to shed light on, is the subject of tax increment financing, TIFs, which have all sorts of, that acronym has all sorts of other interpretations as well. But what exactly is a TIF? What happens there? And what should happen and what does happen?
Let's try talking about it without putting people to sleep.
Yeah.
TIFs are a very clever economic tool. That's the purpose. It's a clever economic tool of a way to try and raise some money to deal with neglected areas, blighted areas. And so the idea is you take a certain geographical area, it might be a 6-block area, whatever, you determine that area, and what happens is you freeze the taxes, the property tax we're talking about, in that if you're all the properties in that, we call a TIF. And if there's an increase in evaluation, which most of the time there is, so like let's say it went from $100 to $110, then the $10 would go into the TIF. Right. And the $100 would go to all the other existing taxing bodies for schools and city government and park district, et cetera. And so it's a clever idea, and it's been used well in some places, and it's popular now all over the country. And it's used well in some places here in the Cook County area. It's also, in my mind, abused too. It became a fascinating cash cow for the city of Chicago, from almost zero in 1986 to collecting $100 million a year a few years later to collecting almost $500 million a year just a few years ago. So that's $5 billion. $500 million a year. Okay, it's gone down a little bit in the last 3 years. And that's a lot of money. And the thing is that taxpayers, they complain about property taxes, but they don't really realize they're also coming up with this extra $500 million a year. A little less in suburban Cook. In suburban Cook, it's a little easier to track because, if Mount Prospect is doing it, or it's also in DuPage and, of course, Cook. Other places are doing it. Usually there's a little more attention to it. They know why they're going to have the TIF. Usually the town people know it. In Chicago, what has happened is they've had so many of them, about 140 TIFs. Most of them are what we call in the greater downtown region. They all touch each other. So it seems like
all of downtown is covered by one TIF or another, it seems.
Yeah, it seems like an awful lot of that. And part of the reason is that if they touch each other, you can port the money. That means you might have, that's why they touch each other. So
you can move the money back and forth from one TIF to the next.
Like, for example, we know, of course, they were scheming for the Olympics, and that didn't happen, but they have money. Now I suspect they're scheming for a casino. So the point is, it's a clever economic tool, and I think it's been used to do important things. I was the alderman in Chicago's 49th Ward up in Rogers Park for a long time, and we had a fairly depressed area where you couldn't get private capital in. So the idea of the TIF is you gradually build up some money, and that usually helps to develop some land.
So you can redo the streets, redo the facades of the stores, or something that really makes the neighborhood more appealing, right?
That's right. And so what that does is it takes money that you wouldn't have from the private sector, and that gets the boost, and then gradually when the private sector comes in, now there's a big jewel there, so then the private money comes back. That's the goal of it. In Chicago, the vast majority of the money has gone to downtown. And people don't understand. Well, I go down Michigan Avenue. It doesn't look too depressed to me. I don't quite understand why it's not going to Englewood.
It's not a blighted area on North Michigan Avenue, right?
But we've found clever ways, in my mind, somewhat unfortunately, to define blighted and so forth. So there's still good projects, but the controversy is often, well, gee, I see we don't have money for our schools and our parks, particularly in poor neighborhoods, and I see we gave, $25 million to Boeing or $50 million to Sears, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we want to have a vibrant downtown. We want to help big business. The real question is how the balance has been. So as county clerk, part of my job is to do a kind of a technical report on this TIF money, because part of my job is also to release the tax rates for the 1,500 taxing bodies in Cook County. Big ones like the City of Chicago, small ones like the Dixmoor Park District. And so what we tried to do in the last several years is to shed more light, to explain this, because people don't understand it. In fact, now, if you're listening and interested, we have a new tax tool, a TIF tool, and it's really cool. If you're, of course, Kevin's really good at this. I'm a little slow when it comes to the technology, but Kevin's a wizard. But you can take that TIF tool, and you can look up cookcountyclerk.com and get your way into the TIFs, and you can look at all the TIFs. You can see how much money. You can see individual properties. You can see the whole TIF. All throughout Cook County. It's pretty fascinating, and you can
so
zoom in.
So you can see
on
whether or not you're in a TIF, and can you see how much money that TIF produces? And
right.
Yeah.
The part that you don't get, because we don't have, and that's the hardest part, is how's all the money being spent? And that's something that we're all struggling with. There are legal responsibilities, but particularly in Chicago, they found ways to make it extremely difficult. I mean, I've had students and experts looking at this for years, and it's really hard to find out exactly how the money is spent. So the controversy about TIF simply is this, that right now there's almost $2 billion sitting in that TIF. And you hear the teachers often talking about that. We don't have money for toilet paper, we don't have money for gym or art or music and so forth. And yet, literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year are going potentially from the schools into projects which are somewhat controversial, like I say, that whether or not Boeing or Sears should get a big hunk of money.
Right, and if we think about the original purpose of TIFs, and I actually, many years ago when I lived in San Diego, we were talking about a TIF in my neighborhood there. This is 25 years ago. But the idea was always that, as you mentioned earlier, it's to improve the area, like take the commercial district, the commercial strip in your neighborhood, and put in new sidewalks or correct the, clean up the facades, something that will attract new business in. But as you've mentioned, maybe giving $50 million as a tax credit or $50 million to Boeing is that really the same purpose? Does it really fulfill the same purpose that the TIFs were created for? Because it's not really directly going into infrastructure. It's going to benefit one particular company that may or may not add to economic growth, especially in a case like in Boeing, where it's really just a matter of moving headquarters. So is that really what the controversy is, that the nuts and bolts of what these TIF dollars are collected for is not necessarily what they get spent on?
That's part of it. See, the offenders, and there are plenty, would argue, well, okay, take the Boeing case or some other major corporation, is that if it leads to significant evaluation or increases in the value of the property, then it leads to increases in property taxes, so they can say, well, see, we got that back and more. I think the fundamental thing, at least in my view, of the controversy is partly, first of all, it's so secretive. Secondly, it became kind of collecting all the money with not exactly knowing how you're going to spend it. Okay, I do believe there's been attempts to be more transparent. I think there's promises made by the mayor, which are a good start. They didn't go as far as we'd hoped. And so when there's controversy about so much money and how it's being spent, and we're desperate for finances in other ways, there's where the controversy comes.
So who manages this money? I mean, this is about $2 billion. Who's in charge of it?
Well, basically, cities, whether it's Chicago or Des Plaines or, Lombard.
But does the TIF district have its own governing body, like a TIF board or anything like that?
Yes, individual TIFs have legal responsibilities, and in Chicago, of course, the aldermen have a big play in or origination of the TIFs and what's going to happen with it. Of course, remember, like I say, so many of them are downtown that I'm not sure it's so easy for the aldermen to keep track of all that. So there are procedures you have to follow. A problem in Chicago, like I say, because it's much bigger, is that for a long time, particularly the previous mayor, as these hundreds of millions of dollars came in every year, it was pretty unclear what the projects are for, where they were going. And so, in my mind, the most critical thing is the balance. In other words, everyone would argue you need a vibrant downtown. People want to build a global city. Right. But does a global city mean that we're going to ignore where most people live? And much less money goes there. And those are the places where they do have the bad streets, the bad infrastructure, CTA not working as well as you want, the schools weak, the housing weak. So the biggest issue I think around TIFs is the money being appropriately spent, and then is it being widely shared in terms of the benefits.
So what kind of transparency would you like to see? If you had the ability to wave your magic wand and make this happen, how would this become much more visible?
Number one, I think all TIF money would be debated by the city council when they do the budget. So they'll do their budget in October, and it's one time you can ask department heads about everything. And if they had also account for that roughly $500 million every year, okay, well, okay, this past year we got $422 million. Okay, where exactly is it going to go? Who's going to be contracted with? All this millions of dollars, are these spent?
Because it does not go through the city council today, correct?
No, no. It's a separate thing. There is no really open budget process when it comes to this. So that would be one thing. Also transparency, that they should all be audited in a very public way. You should be able to look and see, okay, the biggest TIF closed recently, spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, Michigan Avenue, State Street, and all that kind of. And you should be able to look up someplace and say, okay, $400 million was spent over a 20-year period. It went for this, 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 and this, okay? To do that is extremely difficult. If you could, then you could make an honest judgment. Hey, well, you know, I don't know what that Orr guy's talking about. We did this, you know, we built this nice new shopping plaza. It's brought in business. Millennium Park, we all love that, and TIF money was used on that. A lot of TIF money was used for the development of the South Loop. People think that's a big success. But again, in my mind, because the city is also made up of all sorts of people, including folks that are not quite as well off. So yes, we can build beautiful new hotels in the South Loop. I was trying to find a place recently to stay downtown once. I couldn't find anything under $300 in terms of hotels. So the real question is, as we build up a vibrant downtown with TIF money, an enormous amount, hundreds of millions of dollars, what about the rest of the town?
Yes, so are we really building that for the benefit of the vast majority of citizens, or is it a small cadre that's benefiting from the downtown area?
And I would think it's really not for the masses. I don't think it helps other areas that much, of the majority of Chicagoans. It's the old argument, I want a strong downtown. Millennium Park is a great thing. We do believe the improvements in downtown Chicago have a lot of value for our tax base and tourism and so forth. The key is, at what point, though, do we actually help others? And so part of that transparency that you asked about, if we could really see how it's all both been spent and plans to be spent. Because the money we're collecting, a lot of these, like let's say a lot of these are 11 years old, they're going to run for another 10, 12 years. Okay?
Now, is it even possible to go back and get this old data? Is the old data there to be had? Or is this something we would just have to start now and do as we go forward?
Some data is there to be had. There's a lot of promises. If you talk to certain city officials, say, oh, well, you can get this, you can get this. The fact is, I have the most talented people in the state who work on this, and all I can say is, as talented as they are, and reporters that I've dealt with and interns that I've dealt with, it is extremely difficult to really put together, in particularly the big ones, a clear picture. And even if you got a picture of how some of the money was meant to be spent or spent, you still have a really hard time getting at, well, were there competitive bids? Stuff like that. So there's a great more that we could get. And you do get that in some of the suburbs, and that's why I think you can see some suburbs. Yeah, this is what they said they're going to do with the money. They cleared the land. They used some of the TIF money, like say, to do some of these infrastructure improvements. It brought in some business. They developed it. Boom. And that's what we're looking for. If we're going to have this economic tool, it needs to be transparent and used more wisely.
So do you think the tools that you're building, particularly the website, the interactive website tool, do you think that these will help, and are we moving in the right direction to try to get this transparency that you're looking for?
Well, we're moving in the right direction as far as we can. We now have information on your tax bill. So if you live in Cook County, right now you can look in your tax bill. Most people are not in a TIF, probably 13% countywide, a little higher percentage actually if you live in the city of Chicago. But you're still affected by it whether you live in a TIF or not.
Right.
But so now you can look in on your tax bill, and it might say, you know, $600 for schools and $300 for parks and $200 for the city, and it'll say this amount of money for the TIF. And in some cases, people are flabbergasted because their tax bill might be $4,800 and $4,000 of it goes to the TIF.
You mean the vast majority of someone's individual
There
tax
are,
bill?
are circumstances like that. The vast majority of their tax
Right.
money goes to a TIF. So they get confused, but there's a lot of tools now. The TIF tool, so we can provide information about how much money is being collected in the TIFs and the boundaries, et cetera. But it's the city that needs to do a better job in really explaining how it's being spent and what the real plans are, rather than just saying, you know, 10 years from now we're going to improve the highways, or 10 years from now we're going to improve housing. More specificity
Right.
is what's needed, a great deal of it. And like I say, it's becoming a political hot potato because, particularly in Chicago, we have a great shortage of money. So the aldermen are saying, wait a second, stop asking us to raise property taxes, you know, besides the TIF money, and take some of that is not being either used wisely, or we can close some of them early, or we can audit them carefully, and maybe we don't need the 320 million, we only need 270. That would give us 50 million. I offered some suggestions very quickly to the mayor a few months ago to try and prevent what then was going to be a $50 million property tax. It turned into a $50 million phone tax, which I think is very, very unfortunate for Chicagoans. That's extremely difficult, and it's regressive. And I do think there's ways that we could have used the TIF money, and that we already have, so it would not be adding to more property taxes.
So there's two aspects of TIFs as well, if I understand correctly. So first of all, there is this pot of money that exists from the TIF collections that have happened over the years that could be redirected to other things. But as you mentioned a minute ago, is if a TIF district is wound down and ended, then that increment of finance that has been going into the TIF instead goes back into the areas where it would normally be spent, schools, parks, whatever else that property tax money would be spent on. Suddenly that flows into those other areas, particularly education, where all the schools are crying for money, right? Ending the TIFs would send that money back into their budgets, correct?
And that's fortunately been started in the right direction. It's been happening. We've been calling that for a long time. Mayor Daley, starting about, I'm guessing, 3 years ago, started doing some of that. Realizing that there was this kind of, I'd say, a pot of gold, and that he didn't want to raise property taxes when he was in office. So increasingly, and the progressive aldermen been calling for that, and the newspapers were pretty quiet about this. They're beginning to step up their action. So yes, we're moving in that direction where if we could just get better auditing of exactly where the money is and how it's being spent, we could make a better determination. Maybe we could take $100 million away. Now, right now, I said there was $2 billion. It's about $1.7 billion right now.
Current balance, right?
That the city argues they have clear commitments for $1.5 billion of that. I don't think that's really as clear as they believe it is. Okay, so the inference from that, there's only 200,000 that they've
200
got.
million.
200 million that
that's
they have
right.
left to play with.
Still a lot of money, but it's
Right.
not in the order of $1.5 billion.
Right.
So tax issues generally make people's eyes glaze over, sadly.
I don't know if anybody's still listening to us.
We're hoping
yes.
people are still awake and listening,
Right.
listening to us now, right? And you mentioned that the press has not really covered this, and I think my guess would be because it's a very complicated issue. You know, I have had the benefit of working with you over the years and have my own experience with TIFs, so I have a pretty good understanding of how they work, and you're great at explaining it. But it's taken us 20 minutes to go through it, and the average viewer usually doesn't get that much. They see a news item that's maybe 1 minute or a minute and a half long. So how do we get the message out?
Well, there's some actually good things going on. Sometimes, by the way, some of the newspapers shy away because they really want all the downtown development, so they're pleased with it. But there's a couple things. Number one, on our website, again, if you go to countyclerk.com, we got a great little short video.
Yeah.
What is a TIF? And some key questions, so if you want to look at that, it helps. And there's other groups. There's a group that's been going around to every single ward in the city of Chicago and meeting with whoever come out. Sometimes they have big crowds, 100, 200 people, and talking about TIFs, explaining them, talking about TIFs in their particular neighborhood, where they are, what they're doing, the money they're collecting, what they're being spent for. Tom Tresser is a name that you might have heard that does a good job there. There's a great reporter for, Ben Jarowski for Reader that unmercifully picks on the mayor frequently about TIF and TIF money, and does a great job. So there are much better better information and more people looking carefully at it, the teachers union and some of the other unions and other people that believe they're being shortchanged for the schools. So you have more experts talking about it. So we're far more transparent than we were just a few years ago.
Do you expect that this might become an election issue in the upcoming municipal elections?
Absolutely. Yeah. Particularly, well, I think Karen Lewis, representing, her experience with the teachers and so forth, I do think they believe that money is not being spent as wisely as it could be. So I would think she would be taking a strong stand on that, and Mayor Emanuel will be doing his best to defend how the money's been spent. So I think it could be a very big issue.
That would be good for public discourse, right? If we get it out in a campaign, people do pay attention to campaigns.
We need that. This is, I remember, a good way to look at this is when, about 5 or 6 years ago, when the Chicago City Council was faced with a potential $83 million tax increase, they were all going nuts. They were terrified of having to vote for that, okay? That same year, while they were just deliberating this, the $83 million property tax increase, another $500 million was coming out of the same taxpayers, didn't even know about it.
And it's coming into the TIFs.
That's right, coming into the TIF. So, but $500 million of property tax that normally would have gone into the regular pot was being collected, and nobody's paying any attention while they were really desperately upset about having to vote for $83 million tax increase.
So once again, it comes back to the question of accountability. If you could have looked at that $500 million and said, okay, how much of this is really committed to anything that's definitely going to happen, and can we take $83 million out of this pot and plug that hole? Because it's not, and I would say that it's not borrowing. People always say, oh, you're taking from one fund to the next, you're going to have to pay that fund back. But that's not the case here, is it? That this is money that's been collected, it's real money from taxes that are already paid.
It's real property tax money, and you can argue for that, I said earlier, about 13% in Cook County. For the rest of the people that are not in a TIF, that affects them dramatically. Okay, let's say you're south side of Chicago, and of the $422 million collected this year, over 50% normally of the tax bill goes to the schools. So you do the math real quickly, $211 million, something like that. So you might argue all of a sudden there's over $200 million less going to the Chicago public schools. Now, it's not a simple argument because some of the TIF money goes to schools. But it's still, I think all these, the crisis with finances, the fact that more people are talking about it, the fact that there's been enough exposés about how some of the money's been spent, that it's a very valuable, important argument now, because in a city that's desperate for money, and you start telling people, gee, there's this $2 billion pot of money over here,
or whatever it
all of a
is,
sudden, wait, I mean, because I suppose if I was mayor, I'd probably want to hold on to that money too. But I'd hope that it'd be much more transparent. So you can see why any mayor, a small town, big town, would want to have a pot of money they could help maybe plan.
On the other hand, you can take the opposite tack and say, well, what good is having all that money if you're not going to spend it on things where you need it?
Well, we get into the definition of different needs. You know, the current mayor, I think, has a very different vision of what's needed in Chicago than perhaps many people living in the south side, the west side, and other places.
Do you think that this is a slight segue, about the vision of the city, and I think there is this constant tension between, how much is spent on revitalizing the downtown area versus the neighborhoods. And I know this goes back even to the Harold Washington days, how much money should go out to the neighborhoods to help them. And what, and you yourself talked about balance. So where is the correct balance there? I mean, how do you determine what that balance needs to be?
Well, the best way to determine it is to have a vibrant debate and a vibrant democracy. That's hard when you're facing a situation in which the mayor is raising tens of millions of dollars in a separate fund that basically says, this money is going to be destroying aldermen that won't support me and to help those aldermen that will. So there's all sorts of political realities discouraging the kind of debate we should have. In my mind, the balance has been out of whack for a long time. In other words, like I say, I want to see a good downtown. I think it's okay to spend money to do some of these things. There's certain things that I think all the mayors have done that are constructive, but we're way off balance. When you look at the desperation in some of our other neighborhoods, particularly what we did to many African-American schools and schools where Latino kids go, and close so many. So many of them are desperate. And then you look at all we've done to make the high, powerful schools great. You know, it's really nice to have these, we call them magnet and other kind of schools.
Top performing
but at
schools.
some point, where's the balance? It almost seems like in the global city in some people's mind, and we're already seeing that in Chicago, and you see it around the world. The global city means those with means get to move downtown, they get closer there. And now they move downtown, so we got to build these fancy schools. The mayor wanted to spend $60 million for one after they drove most of the poor out of Cabrini Green. Okay, so the point is that one vision of a city is the circle around a kind of broadened downtown is the future. It's the global city. It's high tech. It's good ideas. Everything sounds fine, but it also means we do not put the resources in the rest of the city.
And so the rest of the city is going to suffer.
I think we're missing the balance, and part of the reason we're missing the balance is because our politics are so bad. We're still recovering from the old machine, incredible corruption, maybe $500 million a year worth. And those things, the corruption, the favoritism over the years has hurt us in terms of our structural ability to fix things. If you've got thousands of people that are hired sometimes not to really do their job, that gradually catches up with you. When you contract with many companies that are connected, don't necessarily do the good job of the product they provide. We see that. We see it in the big controversy in recent months over the big privatization of the school janitor. You see things not getting done.
The privatization of parking meters.
Yes, you see, some people getting very rich, but the public services hurting. So what I'm saying is the lack of democracy that may be at the particular city level and the aldermen being able to speak up or whatever, the cost of elections, which means they're less willing to speak up, means increasingly, kind of like the rest of the country, the powerful few tend to determine the future. And I like powerful folks. I think they sometimes have good ideas.
Many would consider you one of those powerful folks.
Well, I don't, but okay, powerful, wealthy people.
Yes.
But and there's some great talent there. We have to make that talent go beyond just the few. That is I think that's
it's the
real
classic
challenge we have.
classic progressive vision, right? That this goes back to the New Deal.
I believe so, yes. Right.
Yeah, where you have to take care of everybody, and you can't just allow those who are already well off to control the funds and to control the agenda.
Right.
That you have to allow that to spread to everyone who has a stake in society.
Yeah, visionary capitalist corporate leaders, sometime in the past we saw that. They understood, you know, take Henry Ford, you know, what good is building all these cars for mass production if no one can
If
afford
my
to
own
buy
employees
it?
can't buy
And
them,
I think we've lost that with all the hedge fund stuff and give me mine, sell it out quick. I have no responsibility for that product. I don't care if I made it. What we really need is to understand that the system we've built up, it seems like it's going well for the few. But at some point, if the majority who is not doing well, if they can't buy in, if they can't have a decent place to live and a decent school and a decent job, that's all going to come to a crash sooner or later. We need visionaries to help us not have a painful, ugly, you know, violence and whatever.
Another
and say
breakdown.
there's ways we can share. There's other cities throughout the world and in the States that are doing things like that. We talk about link development. You know, this.
Well, before we go down that road,
we're probably out of time.
We are in fact out of time. So
that's for another story.
that's for another episode.
Another
right?
time.
So David, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to talk to you here, and as I have many times outside of the show. So thank you once again for being our guest, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate
So
it.
thank you for watching us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Cook County Clerk David Orr. You can see our show every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.